That afternoon, Kris Kristofferson had less than 60 seconds to decide. If he said yes, something he'd protected for years would shift, not dramatically, but permanently. The briefcase sat between them. Phil Spector hadn't opened it yet. The meeting wasn't scheduled. Spector didn't schedule things in 1972. He arrived at studios, at homes, at moments when refusal required more energy than most people had. Kris had been writing in the back room of a Nashville rental when the knock came. Not aggressive, just certain. Spector stood in the doorway holding expensive leather like it contained groceries. "You busy?" Kris wasn't. He said he was finishing something. Spector nodded as if he'd expected the lie, stepped inside without invitation, and set the briefcase on the kitchen table between two empty coffee cups and a legal pad covered in half-finished lines. They'd met twice before. Once at a label party where Spector talked for 40 minutes about wall of sound technique while Kris listened with the attentiveness he used when he didn't want to be remembered. Once in Los Angeles at a session Kris observed but didn't participate in, Spector conducting musicians like a general who expected beauty and obedience in equal measure. This was different, quieter, more transactional. Spector didn't sit. He stood near the table, hands in his pockets, eyes moving around the room, taking in the guitars, the notebooks, the lived-in disorder of someone working alone. Then he looked at Kris with the focus of someone about to ask for something specific. "You write what you want," Spector said. "Not a question, an observation. Mostly. No one tells you what to say. Not often." Spector smiled, brief, knowing. That's about to be expensive. Kris waited. He'd learned early that silence made people clarify themselves faster than questions did. Spector opened the briefcase. It wasn't theatrical. No slow reveal. He flipped the latches, lifted the lid, and turned it so Kris could see the interior without leaning forward. Cash, stacked neatly, more than Kris had made the previous year. Maybe 2 years. 50,000, Spector said, for one song. Kris looked at the money the way he looked at most things, calmly, with the faint analytical distance of someone used to watching himself from the outside. He didn't ask if it was real. It was clearly real. What kind of song? The kind that makes people feel good without making them think. Kris almost smiled. Almost. "You want me to write something I wouldn't write. I want you to write something that sounds like you wrote it, but safer." Spector's tone didn't shift. No persuasion, just clarity. Something a label can push. Something radio won't second-guess. You keep the edge in your voice. You lose the edge in the content. Why me? Because if I ask someone who already writes that way, it'll sound like what it is. Spector closed the briefcase but left his hand on it. If you do it, it'll sound like compromise. And compromise from someone like you? That sells. Kris understood immediately. He didn't like that he understood. The money wasn't the point. The money was context. What Spector wanted, what he was paying for, was the small, imperceptible erosion of the thing people respected about Kris. Not his talent, his refusal to adjust it. "You'd own it," Kris said, "completely. I wouldn't perform it. You wouldn't have to." Spector tilted his head slightly. "Someone else sings it. Your name's on it. You take the check. Everyone wins. Except the song." Spector didn't argue. He didn't need to. The briefcase was still on the table. Kris looked at it again. $50,000. Rent paid for 2 years. Studio time he wouldn't have to borrow. Freedom to write the next 10 things without worrying whether they'd sell. All of it purchased with one song no one would know came from him, except everyone would know, because Spector would make sure of it. That was the cost, not the song, the knowledge. "How long do I have?" "Now's good," Spector said. Kris exhaled slowly. Not stress, calibration. He was already thinking through the mechanics, the structure of something that sounded like him but wasn't. A lyric with imagery but no weight. Melody that borrowed his phrasing without his intent. It wasn't hard to imagine. That was the problem. "I'd need a few days. You'd need an hour." Spector's voice stayed even. "You've already written it. You just haven't admitted it yet." Kris didn't respond. Because Spector was right. Every songwriter had drawer songs, things written in 15 minutes that felt too easy, too obvious, too aligned with what people wanted instead of what needed saying. Kris had 3, maybe 4. He'd never recorded them, never shown them to anyone. They existed in the gap between capability and intent. Spector knew they existed, not specifically, but he knew the type of writer Kris was, the kind who could do the thing he refused to do. One song, Kris said, one song, and no one asks for another. Spector smiled again, sharper this time. I'm not asking now, I'm offering. The distinction mattered. Kris registered it without reacting. Spector wasn't pressuring him. He was presenting a choice that had already been made easier by the amount in the briefcase. Pressure would have given Kris something to resist. This required him to justify saying no to something reasonable. He didn't say no. He didn't say yes either. He asked a different question. Why 50? Because 40 wouldn't make you think twice, and 60 would make you suspicious. Spector picked up the briefcase. 50's the number where you tell yourself it's practical. Kris felt something tighten in his chest. Not panic, but recognition. Spector had calculated him. Not crudely, precisely. The amount wasn't arbitrary. It was engineered to sit in the exact space where principle and necessity overlapped. I'll think about it, Kris said. No, you won't. Spector set the briefcase back down, gently. You'll write the song tonight. You'll tell yourself it doesn't matter because it's just one. You'll cash the check and use the money for something that justifies the compromise. And in 5 years, when someone asks if you ever wrote something you didn't believe in, you'll reframe the question. Kris looked at him, not defensively, with the cool, measured attention he used when someone said something true he didn't want to confirm. You'll say every song's a compromise, Spector continued, that all writing is negotiation between what you mean and what you can say. You'll make it sound philosophical. It'll work. No one will follow up. The room was very quiet. Kris didn't argue. He didn't deflect. He sat with it, the exactness of Spector's prediction. The way it mapped onto things Kris had already thought but hadn't said aloud. I'll send someone tomorrow, Spector said. If the song's ready, they'll bring the briefcase. If it's not, they won't come back. He left without waiting for confirmation. The briefcase stayed. Kris didn't open it again that day. He sat at the table for 20 minutes, not writing, not thinking, just present with the fact of the choice. Then he stood, made coffee, and walked to the window overlooking a stretch of Nashville that looked like every other stretch of Nashville in November. Gray, functional, forgettable. He thought about the money. Not in abstract terms. He thought about what it bought. Time, primarily. The ability to say no to session work he didn't want. The ability to write 3 albums worth of material and release 1. The space between necessity and compromise. He thought about the song Spector wanted. Not the specific song, he hadn't written it yet, but the shape of it. The version of himself that could produce something polished and empty. It wasn't difficult, it was available. He'd spent years learning how to write with intention. The skill didn't disappear when the intention did. What Spector asked for wasn't artistically hard. It was positionally expensive. Kris understood the difference. By midnight, he had the first verse. It wasn't good. It was effective. The language had his cadence, conversational, imagistic, grounded in small observations that felt specific without meaning anything. A song about longing that didn't locate the longing anywhere real. A melody that borrowed from his phrasing but removed the hesitation. He stopped after the second verse. Not because he couldn't finish, because finishing would eliminate the last margin of deniability. If he completed it, the decision was made. If he left it unfinished, he could still tell himself he was considering. He didn't sleep. At 4 a.m, he returned to the table and wrote the bridge. Then the final verse. Then the small lyrical turn at the end that made it feel resolved without actually resolving anything. By sunrise, the song was done. He read it 3 times, not editing, just observing. It sounded like him. It wasn't him. The gap between those 2 facts was where the cost lived. Kris made more coffee and sat with the legal pad in front of him, waiting for the feeling to clarify. Regret, maybe. Resignation. Some internal signal that he'd crossed a line. It didn't come. What came instead was rationalization. Calm, structurally sound, the kind of thinking he was good at. One song didn't define a career. Plenty of writers took commissions. The money allowed freedom everywhere else. No one would hear it and think less of him. They'd hear competence, craft, professionalism. And if they did think less of him, that was projection. He knew what the song was. That was enough. The logic was airtight. That was the problem. Spector's courier arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Young guy. polite, didn't ask questions. Kris handed him the legal pad with the song written clearly in blue ink. The courier glanced at it, nodded, and traded it for the briefcase. He said you'd know what to do with it. Kris took the briefcase, heavier than he expected. Thanks. The courier left. Kris set the briefcase on the table and opened it immediately this time. No hesitation. The money was still there, still real. He touched one of the stacks. Clean bills, tight rubber band. Tangible proof that the last 16 hours had happened. He closed the briefcase and put it in the closet. Then he sat down and tried to write something else. 3 weeks later, he heard the song on the radio. Not his version. Spector had given it to a session singer with a smooth, unmarked voice, someone who sounded pleasant without sounding like anyone. The arrangement was lush. Strings, backup vocals. The production turned the song into exactly what Spector said it would be, something people liked without noticing. Kris listened from beginning to end. When it finished, the DJ said, "That's a new one from Michael Hamilton, written by Kris Kristofferson." Kris turned off the radio. He didn't feel anger. He didn't feel shame. He felt the specific discomfort of hearing himself translated into something accurate but inert. The song worked. It sounded like him. It had none of him. Someone called that evening, a journalist who'd interviewed him twice before. Friendly, casual. Heard the new track. Different for you. "It's a commission," Kris said. "Yeah? Paying the bills?" Something like that. "Still got the good stuff coming though, right?" "Always." The journalist laughed, satisfied. The conversation moved on. Kris hung up and realized how easy that had been. One sentence, no explanation required. People accepted the frame he offered because it made sense. Commissions were normal, practical. Everyone did them. No one asked what he'd traded. He used the money carefully. Rent first. Then studio time for an album he'd been planning for months. The kind of project that required space and silence, and the certainty that he could work without interruption. He recorded it over 6 weeks. Sparse, honest. The kind of writing that felt like confronting something instead of describing it. When it was finished, he listened back and felt the difference immediately. This was him. The other song, the one on the radio, that was something else. A professional gesture. Competent, but sealed. The album was open, vulnerable in ways that made him uneasy even as he approved the final mix. He told himself the contrast proved the commission didn't matter, but the thought arrived with too much effort, like carrying something that should have been lighter. Years later, someone asked him about it in an interview, not directly. They asked if he'd ever written something he didn't fully believe in. Kris paused. The pause lasted longer than usual, long enough that the interviewer started to clarify the question. Kris spoke before they could. "Every song's a negotiation," he said, "between what you mean and what you can say. Sometimes the compromise is in the language. Sometimes it's in the timing. Sometimes it's in who it's for." The interviewer nodded, thoughtful, appreciative. "So it's all compromise in a way." "In a way," Kris said. The answer was accurate. It wasn't complete. The interviewer moved on. The briefcase stayed in the closet for 2 years before Kris threw it away. Not because it meant anything, because it didn't. It was expensive leather holding nothing, taking up space, reminding him of a choice that no longer required reminding. He didn't think about the song often. When he did, it wasn't with regret. It was with the faint discomfort of knowing he'd calculated correctly. The money had bought freedom. The song hadn't damaged his career. No one judged him for it. No one remembered it. That should have felt like winning. It didn't feel like losing either. It felt like the moment when understanding something became the same as justifying it. When intelligence stopped clarifying and started protecting. When the ability to explain a choice replaced the need to question it. Kris never wrote another commission, not because of principle, because Spector never asked again, and because the ease of saying yes once, the rational, careful, structurally sound ease, stayed with him longer than the song did. In 1989, someone played the song at a party Kris attended. He didn't recognize it immediately. It had been 17 years. The arrangement was familiar, but distant, like hearing your own voice on a recording from a decade prior. Then the second verse started, and he remembered. No one at the party knew. Why would they? It was buried in someone's catalog, a minor hit from the early 70s. Pleasant, forgettable. The kind of song that filled time without occupying memory. Kris stood near the window, holding a drink he wasn't drinking, listening. When it ended, someone said, "I forgot how much I liked that one." Another person agreed. Kris said nothing. He left 20 minutes later, not abruptly, just when it made sense to leave. On the drive home, he thought about the briefcase, about Spector's prediction, about the way he'd reframed the question when the interviewer asked. Every song's a negotiation. It was true. It wasn't the truth. The difference lived in the space between what he understood and what he let himself say, between the accuracy of his answers and their completeness, between the intelligence that helped him navigate the world and the intelligence that helped him avoid it. Kris had spent years learning how to think clearly. That night, driving through Los Angeles in the dark, he wondered if clarity had become another form of distance. He didn't answer the question. He let it sit, the way he'd learned to let most things sit, thoughtfully, carefully, just far enough away that they couldn't ask for more.